Dear listener, settle yourself comfortably now, and let us journey together to a place where magic breathes through crooked walls and love weaves itself into every creaking floorboard. Tonight, we visit the Burrow in autumn, where two young souls are learning what it means to build a life together. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the story carry you gently toward rest. The September sun hung low and golden over the Devon countryside, painting the fields in amber light that seemed to drip like honey from the sky. Along a narrow lane, bordered by blackberry brambles and ancient hedgerows, two figures appeared with the soft crack of apparition, a sound that disturbed only a nearby robin, who paused in his evening song before continuing with renewed enthusiasm. Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger stood hand in hand at the end of the familiar path, their trunks materializing beside them with a gentle thump against the earth. Hermione took a deep breath, drawing in the scent of approaching autumn, cut grass and ripening apples, wood smoke and the particular magic that always seemed to hang in the air around the Burrow. The house rose before them in all its impossible glory, a structure that defied both gravity and Muggle architecture with cheerful abandon. 6 or 7 stories tall, depending on how one counted, the Burrow looked as though it had been built by a child stacking boxes, each room added as an afterthought. The whole thing held together more by magic and affection than by any conventional building technique. Home, Ron said softly, and there was such warmth in that single word that Hermione felt her chest tighten with emotion. The house seemed to lean slightly to the left this evening, or perhaps it was merely the way the golden light slanted across its weathered walls. Smoke curled from multiple chimneys, twisting and dancing in shapes that almost seemed deliberate. Phoenixes and dragons and simple spirals of contentment. The garden stretched, wild and wonderful around them, a controlled chaos of late-blooming flowers and vegetable patches where runner beans climbed poles that swayed in the gentle breeze without benefit of wind. As they walked up the path, their feet finding the familiar stones worn smooth by generations of Weasley footsteps, Hermione noticed the changes that time and recent trials had wrought. The garden gnomes were fewer now, and those that remained seemed older, less inclined to bite when Arthur attempted his half-hearted denoming efforts. A new ward shimmered faintly at the property's edge, stronger protections than had existed before the war, nearly invisible, but present to those who knew what to look for. The chicken coop had been expanded, she observed, and there were at least a dozen hens now pecking contentedly at the ground, their feathers catching the evening light. Wind chimes hung from the eaves, crafted from old potion bottles that tinkled with a sound like distant bells. And somewhere in the upper stories, a window stood open, curtains billowing out like welcoming arms. Ron squeezed her hand as they approached the kitchen door, its green paint peeling in places to reveal layers of other colours beneath. Blue and yellow, and a deep red that must have been from decades past. "Ready?" he asked, and Hermione smiled, because with Ron she was learning. She was always ready for whatever came next. Before Ron could even reach for the handle, the door burst open, and Molly Weasley stood framed in the golden light from within, her face alight with joy. "Oh, my dears," she cried, her voice thick with emotion, as she pulled first Ron, then Hermione, into crushing embraces that smelled of pastry and lavender and home. Come in. You must be exhausted from the journey. I've made your favourite biscuits, Ron, and Hermione, dear. I remembered you prefer Earl Grey to breakfast tea. The kitchen enveloped them like a warm blanket, unchanged in all the ways that mattered. The long wooden table still dominated the centre of the room, its surface scarred by countless meals and marked with initials carved when Arthur wasn't looking. Copper pots hung from hooks overhead, gleaming in the light from enchanted candles that floated near the ceiling. The clock on the wall, that marvellous magical timepiece that tracked family members rather than hours, showed most of the hands pointing to home, though Hermione's gaze couldn't help but catch on the one hand that would never move again, forever stilled at Fred's name. Arthur emerged from his workshop, wiping his hands on a cloth that might have once been a tea towel, his face breaking into a warm smile. Hermione, Ron, wonderful to have you here properly. Not just visiting, but staying. The house has missed you. He embraced them both with the same gentle enthusiasm he brought to examining Muggle plugs, and Hermione felt tears prick at her eyes at the simple acceptance in his voice. Dad, you're talking about the house like it's alive, Ron said with fond exasperation, but Arthur merely winked. All houses are alive, my boy, but this one more than most. It knows who belongs here. As if in response, a gentle creak ran through the building's frame, settling and welcoming, and Hermione could have sworn the kitchen grew a fraction warmer, a fraction brighter. It was then that she noticed the others. A small girl of perhaps 7, peering around the doorframe from the sitting room, her dark hair plaited neatly, her eyes wide and cautious. A boy of 10 or 11 sat at the table, carefully writing on parchment, his quill moving with the concentration of someone still mastering the art. In the corner, an elderly woman in a faded purple robe dozed in Arthur's favourite chair, her breathing soft and even. Hermione, Ron, Molly said gently, following Hermione's gaze. I'd like you to meet the newest members of our household. This is Elspeth. She gestured to the small girl, who managed a shy smile. And Thomas there at the table, and that's Arthur's cousin Muriel's sister, Dorothea. Her cottage was damaged in the troubles, and she's staying with us while repairs are made. The war. Hermione heard the weight of all Molly couldn't say in that gentle pause. These children were orphans, their parents lost to battles and Death Eaters and the terrible choices that had torn the wizarding world apart. The Burrow had become what it had always been meant to be, a refuge, a harbour, a place where broken things and broken people could be made whole again. Hello, Elspeth, Hermione said softly, crouching down to the girl's level. I'm Hermione. I used to visit here too, when I was not much older than you. The Burrow is a wonderful place to be. Elspeth's smile grew more confident, and she stepped fully into the kitchen. Mrs. Weasley says you're very clever, that you helped win the war. Hermione felt Ron's hand on her shoulder, steadying, as she always struggled, with how to answer such statements. A lot of people helped, she said finally. But yes, I did what I could, and now I'm here to help make the Burrow even better. Would you like to help me organize the library upstairs? I suspect it could use some attention. The girl's eyes lit up, and Hermione felt a small victory bloom in her chest. Thomas looked up from his parchment, studying Ron with the careful assessment of a boy learning to trust again. You're Ron Weasley, he said, not quite a question. You played keeper for Gryffindor, and you destroyed a Horcrux. Ron shifted uncomfortably, still unused to being known for such things. Yeah, that's Yeah, but mostly I'm just Ron. Do you like Quidditch? The conversation that followed, tentative and gentle, spoke of healing and new beginnings, and Hermione found herself blinking back tears as she helped Molly lay the table for supper. As evening deepened outside the windows, transforming the sky to violet and deep blue, the kitchen filled with warmth and quiet conversation. Arthur asked Hermione about her plans for Muggle magical integration projects, his eyes lighting up at her descriptions of insulation charms that might be enhanced with principles from Muggle engineering. Molly fussed over Ron, filling his plate again and again until he protested with affectionate exasperation. Elspeth sat close to Hermione, occasionally asking shy questions about Hogwarts. Thomas discussed Quidditch tactics with Ron with growing enthusiasm. And there, in that moment, Hermione felt something shift inside her. She had been afraid, she realized. Afraid that coming to the Burrow, planning a domestic life, meant giving up the grand ambitions that had always driven her. Afraid that she would lose herself in the daily rhythms of household magic and family dinners, that she would become somehow less than she had fought so hard to be. But looking around the kitchen, at the children finding safety here, at Molly's fierce love expressed through food and care, at Arthur's gentle wisdom and Ron's steady presence beside her, Hermione began to understand something new. Changing the world didn't always mean grand gestures in the ministry or rewriting laws in distant offices. Sometimes it meant creating a space where broken children could learn to smile again. Sometimes it meant making a house into a home that could withstand any storm. After dinner, Ron levitated their trunks up the narrow, winding stairs, navigating the turns and twists of the Burrow's impossible architecture with the ease of long familiarity. Hermione followed, one hand trailing along the wall, feeling the pulse of old magic in the wood and plaster. The walls were covered in family photographs, moving gently in their frames, a younger Ron pulling a face, Ginny scoring a goal, Fred and George mid-prank, the whole family squeezed together and laughing. But not all the frames held happy memories. There were gaps now, rectangles of slightly darker wallpaper where photos had hung before being removed because the pain was still too fresh. Fred's absence echoed through the house like a missing heartbeat, felt most keenly in the spaces where his laughter should have been. Their room, for it was theirs now, Molly had made clear. Not just Ron's old room, but a space for both of them, was on the 3rd floor, tucked under the eaves. It was small, but cozy, with a window that looked out over the orchard, where apple trees stood heavy with fruit. The bed was covered in one of Molly's quilts, a wedding gift started months ago, each patch stitched with protective charms and mother's love. A desk had been added near the window, clearly meant for Hermione, and shelves waited empty for the books she would unpack tomorrow. Ron set the trunks down with a soft thump and turned to Hermione, pulling her close. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I know this is different from what you might have imagined." Hermione rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Or it will be. I'm just learning what perfect looks like." They stood there in the gathering darkness, the window open to let in the cool autumn air that smelled of apples and distant rain. Below, they could hear the gentle sounds of the house settling for the night. Molly's voice calling the children to bed, Arthur locking up the chicken coop, the creak of old wood, and the whisper of protective charms renewing themselves for another night. Tomorrow, Hermione thought. They would begin. She would start organizing the library, planning improvements, finding ways to make the Burrow both more comfortable and more magical. Ron would help George with the mail order business, healing through work and purpose. They would build something together, not in spite of their different dreams, but because of them. For now, though, there was this. The two of them standing in the room where they would learn to build a life together, in the house that had survived war and loss and emerged standing, crooked and beloved and strong. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the orchard an owl called out a hunting song. The Burrow creaked gently, settling around them like a benediction, and Hermione felt Ron's arms tighten slightly, a promise without words. They were home. And from this home, this foundation of love and magic and stubborn Weasley resilience, they would find their way to change the world, together and in their own time. The first week passed in a blur of discovery and adjustment, each day bringing new understanding of what it meant to live at the Burrow, rather than simply visit. Hermione woke each morning to the sound of roosters crowing in the yard below, their calls layered with the softer sounds of the house itself waking. Pipes groaning to life, stairs creaking as Molly descended to start breakfast, the gentle pop and hiss of the kitchen fire lighting, itself at precisely 6 o'clock. She had expected to find the transition difficult. This shift from wartime urgency to domestic routine, from sleeping in a beaded bag in the wilderness to waking in a proper bed with Ron's arm draped across her waist. But instead, she found herself settling into the rhythms of the Burrow with surprising ease, even as her organized mind catalogued the 1,000 small ways the house could be improved. It was on the 8th morning that Hermione decided to begin her project in earnest. She sat at the breakfast table, a cup of tea steaming before her, and pulled out a fresh roll of parchment. Ron watched her with fond amusement as she began to make lists. She always began with lists, her quill scratching purposefully across the page. "Planning to reorganize the entire Burrow, are we?" he asked, reaching for another piece of toast. "Not reorganize," Hermione corrected, though her lips twitched with a smile. "Optimize. There's a difference. Your mother works so hard, Ron, and with the children here now, and Dorothea. If we could just improve the efficiency of some of the household systems, blend some Muggle engineering principles with the existing magical infrastructure." She trailed off, aware that she was beginning to lecture, but Ron simply grinned at her. "You're brilliant, you know that? Go on then, work your magic. Just maybe warn Mum before you start moving too much around." The library was where Hermione began, because of course it was. The Burrow's collection of books had accumulated over generations, stuffed into a small room on the 4th floor that seemed to exist in a state of permanent chaos. Books were stacked on every surface, crammed into shelves without any discernible system, piled in tottering towers that swayed dangerously when anyone walked past. Some were valuable, ancient tomes on household magic and family histories, while others were battered copies of novels, Quidditch magazines from the 1950s, and what appeared to be an entire set of instruction manuals for magical appliances that no longer existed. Hermione stood in the doorway that first morning, surveying the chaos with the expression of a general planning a campaign. Behind her, small footsteps approached, and she turned to find Elspeth watching her with curious eyes. "Are you going to fix it?" the girl asked quietly. "I'm going to try," Hermione said, then amended. Actually, we're going to fix it. Would you like to help? The smile that spread across Elspeth's face was worth any amount of dust and disorder. They began by removing everything from the shelves, a process that took the entire morning and revealed treasures Hermione suspected even Molly had forgotten existed. A book of Weasley family recipes dating back 200 years, a collection of love letters tied with faded ribbon, a child's drawing of the Burrow signed in wobbly letters. Arthur, age 6. Each discovery was catalogued, set aside carefully, treated with the reverence such personal history deserved. Elspeth proved to be a surprisingly helpful assistant, her small hands perfect for reaching into tight corners, her quiet presence soothing as Hermione worked. They talked as they sorted, gentle conversations about Hogwarts and magic, and what it meant to find a new home. The girl's story emerged gradually, told in fragments. Parents lost in the Battle of Hogwarts, an aunt who tried to care for her but struggled, the relief and fear of coming to the Burrow. Mrs. Weasley says I can go to Hogwarts when I'm 11, Elspeth confided, carefully dusting an old potions textbook. She says the school is being rebuilt even better than before. It is, Hermione assured her, and you'll love it there, I promise. By afternoon, they had sorted the books into piles: magical theory, household magic, fiction, history, Quidditch, and miscellaneous. Hermione had developed a system, of course, colour-coded and cross-referenced, that would make finding any volume a matter of moments, rather than hours. But more than organisation, she wanted to create something welcoming, a space where these children could discover the joy of reading as she once had. She began with the shelves themselves, running her wand along the wood and murmuring repair charms. Splits sealed themselves. Warped boards straightened, and decades of grime lifted away to reveal the warm honey colour of the original oak. Then came the enhancement charms, subtle magic that would prevent the wood from aging further, that would keep books dry even in the dampest weather, that would discourage silverfish and bookworms without harsh pesticides. Now, Hermione said, stepping back to survey her work, let's add something special. She taught Elspeth a charm she'd invented herself during the war, when they'd needed to protect and preserve the books they carried. When activated, tiny points of light would appear along the spine of any book that matched what the reader was searching for. A magical card catalogue more intuitive than any Muggle system. Elspeth watched with wide eyes as Hermione demonstrated, whispering "Charms textbook" and seeing 3 different volumes light up with gentle golden glows. "Can you teach me?" the girl asked breathlessly. "When you're a bit older," Hermione promised, "but I'll show you how to use it for now." As they reshelved the books, now in proper order, now findable, now protected, Hermione found herself explaining her philosophy to the attentive child. "Magic is wonderful," she said, "but sometimes Muggle methods are better. And sometimes the best solution is combining both. Like these shelves, we used magic to repair them, but the organizational system is based on the Dewey Decimal Classification, which is Muggle. Neither one alone would work, as well as both together." By evening, the library was transformed. Where chaos had reigned, now order and beauty held sway. The books stood proud on their shelves, arranged by subject, and then alphabetically within each category. A comfortable reading chair sat by the window, conjured from Hermione's memory of her favourite spot in the Hogwarts library. Soft, magical lighting adjusted itself to the time of day and the reader's needs. A small desk waited for anyone who wanted to take notes or work on homework. Molly appeared in the doorway just as Hermione was adding the final touch, a small sign that read, "The Burrow Library," in elegant script that seemed to shimmer between English and the reader's preferred language. "Oh, Hermione," Molly breathed, one hand rising to her mouth. "It's beautiful. I've been meaning to sort this room for years, but there was always so much else to do, and I never quite knew how to begin." "That's what I'm here for," Hermione said, feeling warmth bloom in her chest at Molly's approval. "To help. This is just the beginning." Over the following days, Hermione moved through the burrow like a benevolent whirlwind, always with Elspeth or Thomas or both children trailing after her, learning and helping. She tackled the insulation next, because autumn was deepening, and the old house leaked warmth like a sieve. But rather than simply casting warming charms, which consumed magical energy constantly, Hermione researched a better solution. She spent hours in her newly organized library, cross-referencing books on household enchantments with the principles of thermal dynamics she'd learned in Muggle primary school. The solution, when it came to her, was elegant in its simplicity. Permanent charms woven into the very walls that would trap heat in winter and keep the house cool in summer, powered not by continuous magical input, but by the ambient magic that already saturated every board and brick of the burrow. Arthur was fascinated by the theory, following Hermione around with a notebook as she explained heat transfer and magical conductivity and the intersection between the two. "Brilliant," he kept exclaiming. "Using the house's own magic as a power source. Why, this could revolutionize magical architecture." The practical application took 3 days and required Ron's help to reach the highest points of the house. They moved from room to room, Hermione carefully inscribing runes along the walls near the ceiling, while Ron held the ladder steady and passed her fresh parchment to reference. The children watched, fascinated, as Hermione worked, explaining each step of the process. "The runes create a circuit," she said, carefully drawing an ancient symbol for containment. "And when the circuit is complete, it will activate automatically, responding to the temperature differential between inside and outside. No more freezing in winter or sweltering in summer." When the final rune was placed and the circuit completed, a visible ripple of magic ran through the house. The burrow seemed to sigh with contentment, settling more firmly into its foundation, and immediately the chill that had been creeping in with the October evenings dissipated. Warmth spread through every room, gentle and even, as natural as breathing. Molly actually cried, standing in the kitchen and feeling the difference. "In all my years," she whispered, "I've never felt the house so comfortable. Hermione, dear, this is extraordinary." But even as Hermione basked in the success of her projects, in the tangible improvements she was making to the beloved chaotic house, a small voice whispered in the back of her mind. She was organizing libraries and improving insulation. She was teaching children basic household charms and helping Molly with the cooking. She was becoming, in essence, a homemaker, a role she had never imagined for herself. Late one evening, after everyone else had gone to bed, Hermione stood in the small study she had created for herself, in what had once been a storage closet on the second floor. It wasn't much, just large enough for a desk, a chair, and 2 shelves of books, but it was hers. She had painted the walls a soft blue with a charm, had installed excellent lighting, had arranged her reference books within easy reach. But what was she using this perfect little study for? Planning household improvements, making lists of groceries, researching better charms for cleaning cauldrons. Was this who she had fought a war to become? Ron found her there, staring at the blank parchment on her desk, her quill lying unused beside it. He didn't say anything at first, just came to stand behind her chair, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "What's wrong?" he asked finally, his voice soft in the quiet night. "I don't know," Hermione admitted. "I'm happy, Ron. I am. I love making the Burrow better. I love helping your mother. I love teaching the children. But I also keep thinking, is this enough? I had plans. I was going to reform the ministry, change laws about house elf rights, work on magical muggle relations at the highest levels. And instead I'm organizing libraries and installing insulation." Ron was quiet for a long moment, his thumbs rubbing gentle circles on her shoulders. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, lacking any trace of the defensiveness she might have expected. "Do you remember what you told Elspeth?" he said. "About how sometimes magic is better, and sometimes muggle methods are better, and sometimes the best solution is both together." Hermione nodded, not sure where he was going. "Maybe it's the same with this," Ron continued. "Maybe you don't have to choose between changing the world and making a home. Maybe you can do both. Different times, different ways. You've got your whole life, Hermione, and you're already changing things. You've made this house better. You're teaching those kids that Muggle knowledge has value. You're showing Mum that there are new ways to do old things. That matters." "But it feels so small," Hermione whispered. "It's not small to Elspeth, or to Mum, or to me." Ron pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "And anyway, who says you have to choose right now? The ministry will still be there next month or next year. These kids need you here now. This house needs you now. And I need you now." Hermione turned in her chair, looking up at him. This boy, this man, who understood her better than she sometimes understood herself. "You're wiser than you give yourself credit for, Ronald Weasley." He grinned, that familiar lopsided smile that still made her heart skip. "Don't tell anyone. I've got a reputation to maintain." They went to bed then, climbing the narrow stairs to their room under the eaves, and Hermione felt the tension that had been building in her chest ease slightly. Ron was right. She didn't have to figure everything out immediately. For now, she could be here, making this small corner of the world better, and that was enough. The next morning dawned bright and crisp, the kind of October day where the sky seems impossibly blue and every leaf glows with colour. Hermione woke to find Ron already up, probably helping George with something in the kitchen. She lay for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house waking around her, and felt a sense of peace settle over her. There would be time for grand ambitions. There would be time for ministry reforms and international magical cooperation and all the large-scale changes she wanted to make. But, for now, there was this. A house full of people who needed her particular blend of magic and method. Children who were learning that intellect and kindness could coexist. A family that had welcomed her without reservation into their wonderful, chaotic fold. Hermione rose and dressed, pulling on comfortable robes and tying back her hair. Today, she thought, she would tackle the pantry. There was a fascinating opportunity there to combine expansion charms with Muggle inventory management systems. And perhaps she would start teaching Thomas some basic organizational magic. The boy had shown aptitude for methodical thinking. As she descended the stairs, the smell of Molly's cooking rising to greet her, the sound of Ron's laughter echoing from the kitchen, the Burrow creaking its good morning welcome, Hermione smiled. This was her life now, at least for this autumn, this season of change and growth, and learning what home truly meant. And perhaps, she thought, that was its own kind of magic, the most powerful kind, the kind that couldn't be found in any book or won in any battle. The magic of choosing where to be and who to be it with, of building something worth protecting, of creating a foundation strong enough to support whatever came next. The kitchen table at the Burrow had always been the heart of the house, but in these autumn days it had taken on a new purpose entirely. Where once it had served primarily for meals and homework, and the occasional explosive experiment that Molly pretended not to notice, it now functioned as the unlikely headquarters of Weasley's Wizard Wheez's rapidly expanding mail-order operation. Ron sat there most mornings after breakfast, the table cleared of dishes and spread instead with order forms, product catalogues, and sample items in various states of development. Extendable ears coiled like sleeping snakes beside jars of carefully labeled ingredients. Pygmy puffs in rainbow colors squeaked from a charmed cage that kept them contained, but comfortable. Prototype skiving snack boxes were arranged in careful rows, each marked with notes about modifications and improvements. George arrived most days around 9 o'clock, apparating directly into the garden and walking in through the kitchen door as though he had never left, as though this had always been his routine. In truth, Ron knew his brother found it difficult to be in the Diagon Alley shop for too long, where every corner held memories of Fred, where the silence of working alone echoed too loudly in the spaces that laughter used to fill. "Morning," George said, as he did every morning, his voice carefully cheerful, in the way that told Ron he'd already had a difficult start to the day. Ready to make some magic happen. They had fallen into a rhythm over the past weeks, these brothers who had once been inseparable from a third, learning to work together in this new configuration. Ron handled the organizational side, sorting orders by product and region, managing inventory, coordinating with the suppliers who provided their raw materials. George focused on the creative work, developing new products, improving existing ones, writing the clever product descriptions that had always been a hallmark of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. This morning, Ron had already sorted through 24 orders that had arrived by owl post at dawn. The mail order business was thriving in ways that surprised them both. Witches and wizards from across Britain and even from the continent were sending requests for products they couldn't easily access, especially those in remote areas far from Diagon Alley. "Look at this one," Ron said, passing George a letter written in careful, elderly handwriting. "Witch in the Outer Hebrides wants 3 decoy detonators and a headless hat. Says her great-grandson is starting Hogwarts next year and she wants to send him off properly equipped." George smiled, the expression reaching his eyes, for perhaps the first time that morning. The Highlands have always appreciated quality mayhem. We should put together a first-year Hogwarts mischief kit. What do you think? Skiving snack boxes, extendable ears, maybe some portable swamp in a smaller, more manageable size. "Brilliant," Ron said, already making notes. "We could offer different house-themed versions. Gryffindors get the full Chaos package. Ravenclaws get the more subtle items. Slytherins get everything, but in a sophisticated black packaging that makes it look respectable." George finished, and they both laughed. It was in these moments that Ron felt the absence most keenly, not in the silence, but in the laughter that was one voice short, one frequency missing from the harmony. Fred would have added something outrageous, would have suggested charming the packages to insult the recipient affectionately, would have turned a good idea into something spectacular and slightly dangerous. But George seemed to sense Ron's thoughts, because he reached across the table and squeezed his brother's shoulder. He'd love this, you know, the two of us, running the business from Mum's kitchen table like we're 12 years old again. Yeah, Ron said quietly. He would. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the kitchen warm around them with the lingering heat from breakfast and the magical insulation Hermione had installed. Through the window, Ron could see Arthur tinkering in his shed, could hear the distant sounds of Molly teaching Elspeth a cleaning charm in the sitting room, could sense the gentle pulse of life that filled the burrow like a heartbeat. Around mid-morning, the owls began to arrive in earnest. They came in ones and twos at first, then in greater numbers, swooping through the specially charmed window that Molly had grudgingly allowed them to install. Barn owls and tawny owls, screech owls, and even a magnificent eagle owl that belonged to a wealthy customer from Surrey. Each carried orders, questions, occasionally complaints that needed addressing. Thomas had appointed himself assistant postal coordinator, a role he took with endearing seriousness. The boy sorted the incoming letters with careful attention, stacking them by type, orders here, inquiries there, fan mail in a separate pile that made George simultaneously pleased and uncomfortable. "Mr. Weasley," Thomas said formally, because despite Ron's repeated requests to just call him Ron, the boy maintained a careful formality. "There are 3 orders here for Peruvian instant darkness powder. We're running low on stock." George consulted his inventory list, frowning. "You're right. I'll need to brew more this week. Ron, can you owl our supplier in Peru? We need more devil's snare seeds for the base." Ron nodded, pulling out fresh parchment. This was the work he was learning to love, the practical, methodical side of making magic happen. Not the flashy spell work or the dramatic heroics, but the steady, reliable effort of keeping a business running, of making sure customers got what they ordered, of solving small problems before they became large ones. He had worried in the beginning that this work would feel too small, too insignificant compared to destroying Horcruxes and fighting Death Eaters. He was Ron Weasley, war hero, best friend to the boy who lived. Shouldn't he be doing something more important than filling orders for extendable ears? But somewhere in the rhythm of the work, in the satisfaction of a well-organized system, and the smile on George's face when a particularly clever order came through, Ron had found something unexpected. Purpose. Not the grand, destiny-driven purpose of the war years, but something quieter and perhaps more sustainable. He was helping his brother heal. He was helping a business thrive. He was proving to himself that he could be good at something that wasn't just following Harry into danger. And yet, the old insecurities still whispered sometimes, especially in the quiet moments. Around noon, Ginny appeared with her usual dramatic flair, landing her broom in the garden and striding into the kitchen with the confidence of someone who had just spent 3 hours practicing Quidditch with professional athletes. Her hair was windswept, her cheeks flushed from exertion and the crisp autumn air, and she radiated the kind of vibrant energy that always seemed to fill whatever room she entered. "Oi, shopkeepers," she announced, helping herself to the leftover scones that Molly had left covered on the counter. "How's commerce?" "Thriving," George said, looking up from a prototype of what appeared to be a self-shuffling deck of exploding snap cards. "How's the professional athletics life treating you?" Ginny dropped into a chair, propping her feet on another one in a way that would have earned a scolding if Molly had been present. "Exhausting. Gwenog Jones is a tyrant. A brilliant tyrant, but still. We've got a match against the Magpies on Saturday, and she's got us running drills like we're training for war." "You basically are," Ron pointed out. "Those magpie chasers play dirty." "So do I," Ginny said with a grin that reminded Ron forcibly of Fred and George in their prime. Then her expression softened, became more thoughtful. "Actually, I came by because I wanted to talk to you, Ron, about the shop." Ron looked up from the order form he'd been completing. "What about it?" "You're good at this," Ginny said simply. "Really good. George told me you've increased efficiency by 40%, that you've expanded the customer base into regions they never reached before, that you've solved inventory problems that had been plaguing them for years. You've got a real head for business." Ron felt heat creep up his neck. "It's just organizing things, making systems work properly. Nothing special." "It's absolutely special," Ginny insisted, and there was an intensity in her eyes that made Ron actually listen. "Do you know how rare it is to be able to see what needs doing and then actually do it without drama or fuss, to make other people's visions work better? That's a gift, Ron. Don't dismiss it." George had stopped working, was watching the exchange with interest. "She's right, you know. I'm the ideas man, but you're the one making those ideas actually function in the real world. We're a good team, better than I expected, honestly." The praise should have made Ron feel good, and a part of him did feel a warm glow of accomplishment. But another part, the part that had spent years comparing himself to a famous best friend and a whole family of exceptional siblings, whispered that this was still somehow not enough. "It's not exactly saving the world, though, is it?" Ron said, trying to keep his tone light, but hearing the edge of something sharper beneath. "Harry's going to be an aura, hunting down the last Death Eaters. Hermione's got plans for ministry reform and international magical cooperation. And I'm sorting mail and managing inventory for a joke shop." The kitchen went very quiet. Even the enchanted clock seemed to pause in its ticking. Ginny leaned forward, her expression fierce. "First of all, it's not just a joke shop. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes helped the Resistance during the war. It's a symbol of defiance against darkness, of choosing laughter over despair. Second, who says you have to save the world the same way Harry does? You already did that. You've earned the right to do whatever the hell makes you happy. And third," George added quietly, "you're saving my world, little brother. I couldn't do this without you. I tried, for months after. I couldn't make it work alone. You're giving me a reason to keep going, to keep building what Fred and I started. If that's not important, I don't know what is." Ron found himself blinking rapidly, something tight in his chest loosening. "I just don't want to be ordinary after everything." "You're not ordinary," came Hermione's voice from the doorway, and Ron turned to see her standing there, flour on her hands from helping Molly bake bread, her eyes warm with understanding. "You're extraordinary at seeing what needs doing and doing it, That's not a small thing, Ron. That's how the world actually gets better. Not through grand gestures, but through 1,000 small acts of competence and care. She crossed to him, leaving flowery fingerprints on his shoulder as she squeezed it gently. Besides, she added with a small smile, who says this is all you'll ever do? You're 19 years old. You've got time to do 100 different things. For now, you're helping George heal, supporting your family, and building something worthwhile. That's enough. You're enough. The conversation shifted then, moved to lighter topics. Ginny's upcoming match, a particularly ridiculous order for 200 pygmy puffs from a wizard who apparently wanted to start a breeding program. Hermione's latest household improvement project. But Ron felt something settle in his chest, some knot of anxiety loosening its grip. That afternoon, after Ginny had left and George had apparated back to the shop to handle the retail side of the business, Ron sat alone at the kitchen table for a few minutes, looking at the organized chaos of their operation. Order forms in neat stacks, inventory carefully tracked, a filing system that actually worked, the physical evidence of his contribution, small though it might seem. Through the window, he could see Hermione in the garden, showing Elspeth how to harvest the last of the autumn vegetables. He could hear his mother singing in the pantry, her voice warm and slightly off-key, as it had always been. He could smell the bread baking, could feel the solid warmth of the house around him, could sense the deep magic of home and family that had always been the Burrow's greatest strength. Maybe this was enough, at least for now. Maybe being the person who made things work, who supported other people's dreams, who brought order to chaos and helped his brother heal. Maybe that was its own kind of heroism. Not the flashy, story-worthy kind, but the quiet, daily kind that actually held the world together. And perhaps, whispered a new voice in his head, one that sounded suspiciously like Hermione's. Perhaps he was building toward something larger without even realizing it. Learning skills that would serve him later, creating connections, understanding how commerce and community and care all wove together into something meaningful. The owl post window rattled as 3 more owls arrived, and Thomas hurried over to help them in, his face bright with the pleasure of having a job he was good at. Ron smiled, pulled over a fresh stack of order forms, and got back to work. Outside, the autumn afternoon was golden and perfect, the kind of day that seemed to exist outside of time, suspended in amber light and gentle peace. And inside, at the kitchen table that had witnessed so much of Weasley history, Ron Weasley continued the quiet work of building a life worth living, one order form at a time. The orchard behind the Burrow had always been one of Ron's favourite places, though he would have been hard-pressed to explain exactly why. Perhaps it was the gnarled old apple trees that his great-grandfather had planted, their branches twisted into shapes that seemed to tell stories if you looked at them long enough. Perhaps it was the way the light filtered through the leaves in golden shafts, or the smell of ripe fruit and earth and magic that hung in the air like a tangible thing. Or perhaps it was simply that the orchard had always been a place of freedom, where rules were relaxed and imagination could run wild. It was a Saturday afternoon in mid-October when the impromptu Quidditch match began, as such things at the Burrow always began, with someone, in this case Ginny, declaring that the weather was too perfect to waste and everyone was getting soft from too much sitting around. "Come on," she called from the garden, her broom already in hand, her eyes alight with competitive fire. "Who's brave enough to face me in the air?" Ron looked up from the product inventory he'd been reviewing, saw the challenge in his sister's grin, and felt something loosen in his chest. When had he last flown for fun? When had any of them simply played? "You're on," he said, abandoning his parchment and heading for the broom shed. Within minutes, the orchard had transformed into an improvised Quidditch pitch. Ron and Ginny were joined by George, who emerged from the house with the slightly haunted look he always wore when memories pressed too close, but whose expression lightened as he mounted his broom. Even Hermione agreed to play, though she insisted on reviewing the safety protocols first, which made everyone laugh. Thomas watched from the ground with wide eyes, too young yet to join, but desperately eager to learn. Elspeth sat beside him, clapping with delight whenever someone scored. Arthur abandoned his shed to referee, his enthusiasm for the game undimmed by decades of watching his children play. They divided into teams, Ron and George against Ginny and Hermione, a matchup that would have seemed unfair if Ginny weren't a professional Quidditch player who could easily outfly all of them. They used apples transfigured into makeshift quaffles, charmed to be soft enough not to cause injury, but enchanted to fly true. The goalposts were conjured between the trees, shimmering and golden in the afternoon light. Ron kicked off from the ground and felt the familiar rush of wind against his face, the surge of freedom that came with flight. Up here, above the earth, the worries that had been circling his mind like gnats seemed to fall away. He wasn't Ron Weasley who needed to prove himself, or Ron Weasley living in the shadow of greater friends. He was just Ron, flying and laughing and playing the game he'd loved since childhood. Ginny was, predictably, brilliant. She dove and spun with the casual grace of someone for whom flying was as natural as walking, scoring goal after goal while Hermione struggled to keep up. But Hermione's determination was its own kind of magic, and Ron watched with pride as she gradually found her rhythm, her intellectual approach to the game translating into careful positioning and strategic thinking. "Not bad, Granger," Ginny called after Hermione successfully blocked one of George's shots. "Maybe there's hope for you yet." George played with an intensity that bordered on recklessness, throwing himself into the game with the kind of abandon that made Arthur call out warnings about broken bones. But Ron understood. This was George's way of outrunning grief, of finding moments where joy could exist without guilt, where laughter didn't feel like a betrayal. They played until the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and deep purple. By then, everyone was breathless and grass-stained and thoroughly content, the kind of tired that comes from physical exertion rather than emotional exhaustion. As they landed, Hermione stumbled slightly, and Ron caught her elbow, steadying her. She turned to him with a smile that made his heart skip, her hair wild from the wind, her cheeks flushed with colour, her eyes bright with something he'd been afraid she'd lost, pure, uncomplicated joy. "That was wonderful," she said, slightly breathless. "I'd forgotten how much I actually enjoy flying when I'm not terrified of falling off or being chased by Death Eaters." "You were good," Ron told her honestly. "Really good. Natural keeper instincts." She laughed, the sound like music in the autumn air. "I think you're biased, but I'll take the compliment." That evening, after dinner, Ron found himself in Arthur's shed, that magnificent chaos of Muggle artifacts and half-finished projects that had always been his father's sanctuary. Arthur was bent over what appeared to be a toaster, examining it with the intense fascination he brought to all Muggle technology. "Dad," Ron said from the doorway, "got a minute?" Arthur looked up, his face brightening. "Always, my boy. Come in, come in. I'm trying to understand how this makes bread brown without magic. Fascinating stuff. The Muggles are so clever, finding ways to do everything without wands." Ron settled onto a stool, watching his father work. There was something soothing about Arthur's gentle enthusiasm, his unshakable belief that everything in the world was worthy of interest and wonder. "I've been thinking," Ron said slowly, "about what I'm doing. With the joke shop, I mean. And living here. And everything." Arthur set down his screwdriver, giving Ron his full attention in the way that had always made Ron feel heard, valued, important. Having doubts. Not exactly doubts. More like questions, I suppose. Ron struggled to articulate the tangle of thoughts and feelings. Everyone keeps saying I'm doing well, that I'm good at the business side of things. And I am, I think. I enjoy it. But I keep wondering if I should be doing something more significant. "Ah," Arthur said, nodding thoughtfully. "The burden of having done extraordinary things young. You think that everything that follows must be equally extraordinary, or else it doesn't count." "Something like that," Ron admitted. Arthur was quiet for a moment, turning a plug over in his hands, a gesture Ron recognized as his thinking motion. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Let me tell you something I learned, Ron. I've spent my entire career at the Ministry in the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office. Not a prestigious department. Not particularly well paid. Most people think it's a bit of a joke, actually. But I love it. I love learning about Muggle ingenuity. I love protecting both wizards and Muggles from dangerous enchanted objects. I love the work itself." He paused, meeting Ron's eyes. "For years, I worried that I should have been more ambitious. Your mother's brothers were Aurors, after all. Important, dangerous work. But eventually I realized something. The world needs people who do the everyday work well just as much as it needs heroes. Maybe more. Heroes save the day. But it's the people doing the ordinary work who keep the world running between crises." Ron felt something tight in his chest begin to ease. "So you don't think I'm wasting my potential? Working for a joke shop instead of becoming an Aura or something? I think you're using your potential." "Exactly right," Arthur said firmly. "You're helping your brother heal. You're learning valuable skills. You're contributing to your family and your community. And Ron, you've already been a hero. You helped save the wizarding world. You've earned the right to do whatever makes you happy, whether that's grand or ordinary or somewhere in between." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Arthur returning to his toaster while Ron processed this conversation. Through the shed's small window, he could see the Burrow, its lights glowing warm against the deepening twilight, smoke curling from chimneys, the magical clock visible through the kitchen window with its hands pointing to home and travelling, and, heartbreakingly, one hand still and silent. "Dad," Ron said quietly, how do you keep going? With Fred's hand on the clock, right there where you see it every day?" Arthur's hand stilled on the toaster. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes, but his voice was steady. "We keep going because that's what the living do, Ron. We carry our dead with us. We honor them by continuing to live and love and find joy where we can. That clock hand, it's painful, yes, but it's also a reminder. Fred was here. He was real. He mattered. And as long as we remember him, as long as George keeps the shop running and you keep making people laugh with his inventions, he's still part of our lives. Ron nodded, unable to speak, past the lump in his throat. Besides, Arthur added, his tone lightening slightly, your mother won't let me remove it. Says it would be like losing him twice. So we look at it, and we remember, and we keep going. That's all we can do. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with frost sparkling on the grass like scattered diamonds. Hermione woke early, as she usually did, and found Molly already in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with the steady, rhythmic motions of someone who had performed this task thousands of times. Good. Morning, dear? Molly said warmly. Tea's fresh? Help yourself. Hermione poured a cup and settled at the table, watching Molly work. There was something meditative about it, the way Molly's hands moved, the way she seemed to put love itself into the dough with each press and fold. Molly, Hermione said hesitantly, can I ask you something? Of course, dear. Anything. Do you ever feel limited? By domestic life, I mean. You're so talented, so powerful. You defeated Bellatrix Lestrange in a duel, for heaven's sake. Don't you ever wish you'd done something more with your magic, something beyond raising children and keeping house? Molly's hands stilled on the dough. She looked at Hermione with eyes that held both understanding and a gentle kind of wisdom. Oh, Hermione, do you know what I did? What I really did? Hermione waited, uncertain. I raised 7 children in a world at war, Molly said quietly. I created a home that was safe and warm and full of love, even when dark. Wizards were hunting us, even when money was scarce, even when fear pressed close. I taught my children that goodness and laughter and family mattered more than blood purity or power or wealth. And yes, I kept house. I cooked meals and cleaned rooms and mended robes. But every meal was an act of love. Every spell was protection. Every moment was choosing to create light in dark times. She resumed kneading, her voice steady. I'm not saying every woman should choose this path. But for me, this was never a limitation. It was my battlefield, my ministry, my life's work, and I'm proud of it. Hermione felt tears prick at her eyes. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to suggest... I know you didn't, dear. Molly smiled gently. But here's what I want you to understand. There's no one right way to be powerful, to be important, to matter. You can change the world through laws and politics and grand reforms. Or you can change it by raising children who understand justice, by creating spaces where people feel safe, by doing the daily work of making life better for the people around you. Both matter. Both count. She paused, then added, and Hermione, you don't have to choose only one. You can have both. Different seasons for different work. That's what life is, really. Knowing when to fight and when to build, when to push forward and when to rest and gather strength. Later that afternoon, Hermione stood in the Burrow's library. Her library now, really. Transformed and organized and loved, and thought about Molly's words. Through the window she could see Ron in the garden, playing with Thomas and Elspeth, teaching them a simple levitation charm while they shrieked with laughter. She could see George in the kitchen, visible through another window, working on product development with an expression of focused contentment. She could see Arthur in his shed, Ginny landing her broom in the yard, Molly hanging laundry that billowed in the autumn breeze like colourful sails. This was a kind of magic too, wasn't it? This choosing to be here, to invest in these relationships, to make this ramshackle, impossible house into a better version of itself. It wasn't the grand stage of ministry politics or international magical cooperation, but it was real and immediate and needed. And more than that, she was happy. Genuinely, unexpectedly happy in a way she hadn't been since before the war began. Maybe since before she'd even started Hogwarts and learned that being clever wasn't always the same as being accepted. Ron found her there as evening fell, standing by the window with her arms wrapped around herself, a small smile on her face. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, sliding an arm around her waist. "I was just thinking," Hermione said, leaning into his warmth, "that maybe balance isn't about choosing between things. Maybe it's about allowing ourselves to want different things at different times, to be complex and contradictory and human." "Deep thoughts for a Saturday evening," Ron teased, but his voice was tender. "I'm serious, Ron. I spent so long thinking I had to have my whole life planned out, had to know exactly what I wanted and pursue it single-mindedly. But what if that's not how life works? What if it's okay to want this?" She gestured at the Burrow, at the family visible through the windows. "And also want to reform wizarding law. To love organizing your mother's library and also dream of international magical cooperation." "Then you want both," Ron said simply. "And you find ways to do both, in time. Not all at once, maybe, but eventually." Hermione turned in his arms, looking up at him. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise," Ron said with a grin. "You just distracted by how devastatingly handsome I am." She laughed and kissed him, and outside the window the sun set over the orchard where they had played that afternoon, where apples hung heavy on ancient branches, where magic and joy and ordinary life wove together into something precious and real. The Burrow settled around them as darkness fell, the house creaking its evening song, protective wards humming gently, the scent of Molly's cooking rising from the kitchen. And in the library, in each other's arms, Ron and Hermione stood in a moment of perfect understanding, of balance, found not through choosing, but through accepting that they could be many things, want many things, and still be whole. The storm came on a Tuesday in late October, announced first by a strange heaviness in the air, a pressure that made even the house seem to hold its breath. Hermione noticed it at breakfast, the way the enchanted candles flickered uneasily, the way Molly's knitting needles clicked with unusual agitation in their basket by the fire, working on a project, even though no one was directing them. "Storm coming," Arthur said, glancing out the window at the sky that had turned the colour of old pewter. "A big one, I think. We should check the wards, make sure everything's secure." By mid-morning, the wind had begun to pick up, rushing through the orchard with a sound like the sea, setting the apple trees swaying and bending. Leaves, brilliant in their autumn colours just yesterday, were stripped from branches and sent spiralling through the air in great swirling clouds of gold and crimson and brown. Ron and Arthur went around the property together, checking the structural spells that held the Burrow upright, reinforcing the protections on the chicken coop and the shed, bringing in anything that might blow away. George arrived from Diagon Alley just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, apparating into the kitchen with his robes already damp. "Shop's closed for the day," he announced. "The weather warning just went out. Ministry's saying this is going to be the worst storm we've had in years." By noon, the storm had arrived in earnest. Rain lashed against the windows in sheets, driven by wind that howled around the corners of the house like something alive and angry. Thunder rolled across the sky in long, rumbling waves that seemed to shake the very air, and lightning split the darkness with brilliant branching light. Inside, the family gathered in the kitchen and sitting room, the children wide-eyed but not truly frightened, not with Molly there, radiating calm competence, not with the house's familiar warmth surrounding them. Hermione had set up a reading circle with Elspeth and Thomas, going through a children's book about magical creatures, while Ron and George inventoried their product supplies, and Arthur attempted to interest anyone who would listen in the Muggle phenomenon of barometric pressure. It was around 2 in the afternoon when the first crack came, a sound that was different from the thunder, sharper and more immediate. The house shuddered, a ripple running through its frame, and everyone froze. "That didn't sound good," Ron said, already moving toward the stairs. They found the problem on the 4th floor in one of the older sections of the house. A section of wall had developed a crack, running from ceiling to floor like a lightning bolt frozen in plaster. Through it they could see daylight, grey and storm-tossed, but daylight nonetheless, and rain was beginning to seep through. "Oh no," Molly breathed, her hand rising to her mouth. That's structural. That wall is load-bearing." Arthur was already examining it, his wand out, running diagnostic charms. "The support spells have failed," he said grimly. "Must have been weakened over time, and the storm's pushing against them. We need to repair this now, before it gets worse." What followed was organized chaos. Arthur directed while everyone else worked. Ron and George levitating furniture out of the way. Hermione researching the correct repair spells in a handbook Arthur produced from somewhere. Molly mixing a special plaster that would accept magical reinforcement. Even the children helped, Thomas holding tools and Elspeth carefully sorting the ingredients Molly needed. Outside, the storm raged on, seemingly intensifying in response to their efforts. Rain pounded against the roof, wind shrieked around the eaves, and occasionally the whole house groaned and shifted, settling unevenly on its magical foundations. They worked for hours, repairing not just the obvious crack, but discovering and addressing other weaknesses as they went. The 4th floor bedroom needed new support beams, conjured and then strengthened with permanent charms. The roof had 3 separate leaks that required patching. A window frame had rotted and needed replacing entirely. It was exhausting, dirty work, complicated by the storm that seemed determined to undo everything they accomplished. Hermione found herself plastered with dust and plaster, her hair escaping its tie in wild curls, her arms aching from holding heavy beams in place, while Ron and Arthur secured them. And it was in the midst of this chaos, this urgent scramble to hold the beloved house together, that Hermione felt something inside her begin to crack as well. She was crouched in the corner of the 4th floor bedroom, applying a strengthening charm to a joint that Arthur had identified as weak, when the thought struck her with sudden, overwhelming force. What am I doing here? Not here in this room, helping repair storm damage? That made perfect sense. But here at the Burrow, spending her days organizing libraries and improving insulation and learning to cook Molly's recipes. Here, playing house while the world moved on without her, while important decisions were being made in the ministry, while injustices went unchallenged, while she became smaller and smaller, until she disappeared entirely into the role of Ron Weasley's helpful girlfriend. The fear she'd been pushing down for weeks suddenly surged up, sharp and choking. She was losing herself. She was becoming domestic, ordinary, forgettable. All those years of fighting and studying and proving herself. And for what? To spend her life fixing other people's houses and organizing other people's things. Hermione? Ron's voice came from across the room, concerned. You all right? Fine, she said automatically, but her voice came out strained, tight. I'm fine. She wasn't fine. Her hands were shaking as she lowered her wand, and suddenly she couldn't breathe properly, couldn't think past the panic rising in her chest. I need air, she managed, and fled down the stairs before anyone could stop her. She made it to the small study she'd created for herself, the tiny room that was supposed to be her sanctuary, and slammed the door behind her. Rain lashed against the single window, and the wind howled, and Hermione sank into her chair and put her head in her hands. What was she doing? What had she become? She'd had plans, grand, important plans. She was going to reform SPEW into an actual, effective organization for house elf rights. She was going to work on integrating Muggle-born protections into wizarding law. She was going to take her NEWTs and go to university. Maybe even a Muggle university. To learn new perspectives on governance and law. She was going to change things. Instead, she was here, at the Burrow, organizing pantries and teaching children and helping her future mother-in-law with laundry. Playing at being a housewife before she was even 20 years old. The door opened quietly, and Ron slipped in, closing it behind him. He was covered in dust and plaster, his hair standing on end, his shirt torn at one shoulder. He looked exhausted and worried, and somehow still impossibly dear to her. Talk to me, he said simply, not coming closer, giving her space. I can't do this, Hermione said, and her voice broke. Ron, I can't. I thought I could. I thought I wanted this, but I'm losing myself. Every day I'm here, I'm becoming less of who I was supposed to be, and I don't know how to stop it. Ron was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. What do you think you're supposed to be, Hermione? Important. The word burst out of her, raw and desperate. Someone who matters. Someone who changes things. Not just someone's wife, someone's helper. I fought in a war, Ron. I destroyed Horcruxes. I can't just bake bread and organize libraries for the rest of my life. Who said you had to? Ron asked, and there was something in his tone that made Hermione actually look at him. Really look at him. He moved closer now, slowly, until he could crouch in front of her chair, taking her hands in his dusty ones. Hermione, you've been here for 6 weeks. 6 weeks, out of your entire life. And in that time, you've made real improvements to this house. You've helped 2 war orphans start to heal. You've supported my brother through his grief, and you've given my mum the first real help she's had in years. That's not becoming less. That's being exactly who you've always been, someone who sees what needs doing and does it. But I had plans. And you still have plans, Ron interrupted gently. Nothing's changed, except that you're taking a few months to rest and help your family. Our family. You're not trapped here, Hermione. You're choosing to be here for now. There's a difference. But what if I get comfortable? What if I forget? you. Ron actually laughed, though kindly. Forget your ambitions. Hermione, you're the most driven person I've ever met. A few months of domestic life isn't going to erase that. If anything, I think you're learning things that will make you better at whatever you do next. You're learning how real people live, what they need, how systems actually work in practice instead of just theory. Hermione wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because he was right, wasn't he? She had learned things here, about how households functioned, about the gap between magical theory and practical application, about what families needed to thrive, knowledge that would be invaluable if she ever did work on domestic policy or family law. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I'm scared of becoming ordinary, of losing the person I fought so hard to be." Ron squeezed her hands. "You could never be ordinary. And Hermione, you don't have to prove anything to anyone, least of all to me. You've already proven everything. You're allowed to rest. You're allowed to enjoy simple things. You're allowed to be happy without constantly striving for the next achievement." But what if being happy here means giving up on changing the world? "It doesn't," came Molly's voice from the doorway, and both of them turned to see her standing there, concern etched on her face. "Oh, Hermione, dear, it doesn't mean that at all." She came into the small room, somehow making space in the cramped quarters, and sat on the edge of the desk. "I heard what you said, and I need you to understand something. Being here, helping here, choosing to invest in family and home, that's not giving up on the world. It's learning what's worth fighting for." Molly's voice was gentle, but intense, carrying the weight of her years and experience. "You want to change wizarding law? Then you need to understand how those laws affect real families, real children, real lives. You want to reform the ministry. Then you need to know what everyday witches and wizards actually need, not what politicians think they need. You can't change the world effectively if you don't understand it, and you can't understand it from books and theories alone. Besides," she added, her tone softening, "who says you have to choose right now? You're 19 years old. You have decades ahead of you. Can't some of those decades be for different things? Some for building a home, some for building a career, some for raising children if you want them, some for changing laws and breaking barriers. Why does it have to be all or nothing?" Hermione felt tears streaming down her face now, the tension that had been building for weeks finally breaking like the storm outside. "I just don't want to disappear. I don't want to be forgotten." "You won't be," Ron said fiercely. "Hermione, you're Hermione Granger. You're going to do amazing things. I know it. But right now, today, you're also someone who's helping hold this family together, and that matters. It all matters. You're allowed to be both." Outside, the storm was beginning to ease. The thunder had moved off into the distance. The rain had gentled from a torrent to a steady patter. And through a break in the clouds, a shaft of pale sunlight slanted down across the orchard. Arthur appeared in the doorway, looking between them with understanding in his eyes. "The main repairs are done," he said quietly. "The house is stable, but I could use everyone's help checking the rest of the structure, making sure there aren't other weak points we've missed, if you're up for it." Hermione wiped her eyes, drew a shaky breath, and nodded. Ron helped her to her feet, and together they rejoined the family effort. For the rest of the afternoon, they worked as a unit, checking every room, every support beam, every charm and spell that held the impossible house together. And as Hermione worked, running diagnostic spells and reinforcing weak points, she began to see the Burrow differently. This house, she realized, was a perfect metaphor. It shouldn't stand. It defied all conventional architecture, all normal building principles. But it did stand, because magic and love and stubborn Weasley determination held it together. It was strong because it was flexible, because it adapted, because it had been built and rebuilt over generations, each addition making it more itself. Maybe she could be like that too. Not fixed and rigid in her plans, but flexible enough to adapt, to add new rooms to herself, to become more complex and contradictory and whole. That evening, after the storm had passed and the house had been secured, and everyone had gathered in the kitchen for a late dinner of soup and bread, Elspeth tugged on Hermione's sleeve. "Miss Hermione," she said quietly, "are you staying? I heard you talking, and I thought, are you leaving?" Hermione looked down at the girl's anxious face, saw Thomas watching from across the table with the same worried expression, saw Molly trying not to show her concern, saw Ron's steady presence beside her. "I'm staying," she said, and felt the truth of it settle in her chest. "For now, I'm staying. This is where I need to be." The relief on their faces told her she'd made the right choice, not forever, not abandoning her dreams, but for now, for this season. There would be time for everything else. There would be time for grand reforms and ministry positions and changing wizarding law. But right now, there was this. A house that needed her, children who needed her, a family that had opened their arms and hearts to her. And more than that, there was Ron, who had understood her panic and talked her through it, who believed in both her ambitions and her right to rest, who saw all of her, driven and domestic, brilliant and scared, strong and vulnerable, and loved her anyway. Later that night, lying in bed with Ron's arm around her, and the sound of rain still pattering gently on the roof, Hermione felt something settle in her soul. She hadn't lost herself. She had simply discovered that she could be more than one thing, want more than one thing, live more than one kind of life. The Burrow creaked gently around them, the house that had weathered the storm and emerged stronger for it, held together by magic and love and the willingness of everyone within it to work together when it mattered most. "Thank you," Hermione whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Ron murmured, half asleep. "For understanding. For not letting me run away from myself." Ron pulled her closer, pressed a kiss to her hair. "Always," he said, simply. "That's what we do." And outside, the storm clouds cleared to reveal a sky full of stars, bright and clear and infinite, full of all the possibilities that waited for them both, in their own time, in their own ways. November arrived at the Burrow with a whisper rather than a shout, slipping in on frost-touched mornings and evenings that came earlier each day. The orchard trees stood bare now, their leaves long since fallen, to create a carpet of russet and gold on the ground below. The garden had been put to bed for winter, the last vegetables harvested, the earth turned and blessed with preservation charms that would keep it rich and ready for spring planting. Inside the house, the improvements Hermione had made showed their worth. The insulation charms held the warmth close, making even the coldest mornings comfortable. The library had become a favorite gathering place for the children, who could now find any book they wanted with ease. The organizational systems Hermione had implemented throughout the house had brought a new efficiency to daily life. though Molly still complained fondly that she could never find anything because it was all so tidy now. Ron had settled into his work with the joke shop with a contentment that surprised him. The mail order business was thriving beyond George's wildest projections, and Ron's systematic approach to inventory and customer service had transformed what had been a chaotic side venture into a profitable, sustainable operation. More than that, he'd discovered he had a talent for identifying which products would appeal to which markets, for writing engaging catalogue descriptions, for solving logistical puzzles. It was a cold Tuesday morning in mid-November when the owl arrived that would change everything. Hermione was in the kitchen, helping Molly prepare breakfast, while Thomas practiced his wand movements at the table under Arthur's patient instruction. The large barn owl swooped through the window with the distinctive efficiency of official ministry post, landing directly in front of Hermione and extending its leg with almost reproachful dignity, as if annoyed to have been kept waiting. The letter bore the ministry seal, not just any department, but the minister's office itself. Hermione's hands trembled slightly as she broke the wax and unfolded the heavy parchment. Dear Miss Granger, we are pleased to extend to you an offer of position within the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, reporting directly to the Office of the Minister for Magic. Your role would focus on the review and reform of legislation pertaining to magical creature rights, Muggle-born integration, and educational access. This is a newly created position, designed specifically for someone with your unique qualifications and perspective. We believe your insights would be invaluable in shaping the future of wizarding law. Please respond at your earliest convenience. We would hope to have you begin by the 1st of December. The letter continued with details of salary, responsibilities, and expectations, but Hermione had stopped reading. Her heart was pounding, her mind racing. This was it. This was everything she'd wanted. Meaningful work, real influence, the chance to actually change the laws that governed the wizarding world. This was her future. Arriving on official parchment, asking for an answer. Good news? Molly asked gently, though her tone suggested she already knew, could read the mixture of excitement and anxiety on Hermione's face. The ministry, Hermione managed. They're offering me a position, a real position, working on law reform. Ron appeared in the doorway, still tousled from sleep, drawn by the unusual tension in Hermione's voice. His eyes found hers across the kitchen, and she saw him understand immediately what this meant. That's brilliant, he said, and his smile was genuine, even as something flickered in his eyes. Not jealousy exactly, but something more complex. You should take it. Obviously, you should take it. Should she? The certainty she'd expected to feel wasn't there. Instead, there was a confused tangle of excitement and reluctance, ambition and attachment, fear of missing this opportunity, and fear of leaving this place that had become, against all expectations, a home. I need to think, Hermione said quietly. I'll be in the library. She fled before anyone could respond, clutching the letter like a lifeline or an anchor. She wasn't sure which. The library, her library, welcomed her with its familiar scent of old paper and furniture polish, and the faint, magical tingle of preservation spells. Hermione sank into the reading chair by the window, looking out at the frost-silvered garden, and tried to make sense of the chaos in her mind. This was what she wanted, wasn't it? She'd spent weeks here, building and organizing and helping, all while telling herself it was temporary, that her real life was waiting somewhere else. And now here it was, that real life offering itself to her on ministry letterhead. She should be ecstatic. She should already be composing her acceptance letter. Instead, she felt torn in two. The morning passed in a blur. Hermione sat with the letter, reading it over and over, making lists of pros and cons, trying to apply logic to a decision that felt anything but logical. She barely noticed when Elspeth brought her tea, or when Arthur poked his head in to ask if she wanted lunch. It was late afternoon when Ron finally came to find her, settling into the chair across from hers with the patient stillness of someone prepared to wait as long as necessary. "Talk to me," he said simply. "I don't know what to say," Hermione admitted. "I should want this. I do want this. But I don't want to leave. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. And I don't understand why I feel that way." Ron was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes thoughtful in the fading light. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "Can I tell you what I think? And you can tell me if I'm completely off base." Hermione nodded. "I think you're scared," Ron said gently. "Not of the work. You'd be brilliant at it. But of what taking that job means about who you are. You've spent so long defining yourself by ambition and achievement that the idea of choosing not to take something just because you're not ready yet feels like failure. Like you're proving all your worst fears about yourself right. That you're becoming ordinary, domestic, less than you were." The accuracy of it stole Hermione's breath. "But here's the thing," Ron continued, leaning forward. "Choosing when to take a job isn't the same as giving up on ambition. It's not weakness to say, not yet. It's not failure to recognize that you need more time here, doing this work, being with this family. You're allowed to make choices based on what you want, not just what you think you should want." "But what if I'm making excuses?" Hermione whispered. "What if I'm just scared of the work, of failing, and I'm hiding here where it's comfortable and safe?" "Are you?" Ron asked directly. "Is that what this feels like to you?" Hermione closed her eyes, trying to be honest with herself. Was she afraid of the ministry position? Yes, a little. It was a big responsibility, and she was young, and there would be people who resented her appointment. But that wasn't what was keeping her from saying yes immediately. What she felt, she realized, was incomplete, like there was work here that wasn't finished yet. Elspeth was just beginning to come out of her shell, to trust that this home was permanent. Thomas had started asking about Hogwarts, about his future, with cautious hope, instead of dull resignation. The house itself felt like a project only half completed, so much potential still unrealized, so many small improvements that could make such a difference. And Ron was finding himself here, discovering talents he'd never known he had, healing from the war in his own way. She wasn't ready to leave him yet, wasn't ready to navigate the demands of a high-pressure ministry job, while also trying to maintain a relationship across the distance between the Burrow and London. "No," she said finally, opening her eyes. "I'm not hiding. I'm just not done here yet. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Ron said, and his smile was warm with relief and something else, pride, maybe, or respect. "So tell them that. Tell them you're honored, but you're not ready to start in December. See if they'll hold the position, or if they'd consider you for a later start date." "They might not," Hermione pointed out. They might offer it to someone else. Then that's meant to be, Ron said with a shrug that tried for casual, but didn't quite make it. There will be other positions, other opportunities, but there's only one now, and you're here, and we're here, and maybe that's where you need to be for a bit longer. Hermione felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of anxiety unwinding. When did you get so wise about life decisions? Since I started making my own, instead of just following Harry into whatever insane thing he was doing next, Ron said with a grin. Then his expression grew more serious. Actually, I need to tell you something too, about the shop. Hermione sat up straighter, sudden concern flooding through her. What about it? Nothing bad, Ron assured her quickly. Actually, something good. George and I have been talking, and he wants to make me a partner. Not just an employee, but an actual partner in the business. Equal shares, equal say in decisions, the whole thing. The surprise must have shown on Hermione's face, because Ron laughed. Yeah, I had the same reaction. But he's serious. He says I've transformed the business side of things, that he couldn't do this without me, that it should be Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, plural, not singular. Ron, that's incredible. Hermione's mind was already racing ahead, seeing the implications. That's a real career, real ownership. You'd be building something significant, something that matters. That's what George said, Ron admitted, and I think I want to do it. But it would mean committing to the shop long term, really investing in it. Not just helping out for a few months, but making it my life's work, at least for a good while. He paused, then added quietly, which is why I need to know that you're okay with it. With me not being, I don't know, not being an aura or a ministry official or something more impressive sounding. Hermione stared at him, understanding flooding through her. They were both doing the same thing, measuring their choices against some imagined standard of what they should be, should want, should achieve. Both of them scared of being ordinary, of disappointing the other, of not living up to the heroic versions of themselves that the war had created. Ron, she said firmly, I am proud of you. I am so proud of what you're building with George, of how you've helped him heal, of the business acumen you've discovered in yourself. I don't need you to be an aura or a ministry official. I need you to be happy, to be doing work that fulfills you. And if that's running a joke shop, then that's perfect. Relief washed over Ron's face, followed by something that looked suspiciously like tears glinting in his eyes. Yeah? Yeah, Hermione said softly. We're both allowed to choose our own paths, Ron. We don't have to be what other people expect. We just have to be honest with each other about what we really want. They sat in silence for a moment, the late afternoon light fading to dusk outside the window, the library warm and peaceful around them. So, Ron said finally, what are you going to tell the ministry? Hermione took a deep breath, feeling the decision crystallize with sudden clarity. I'm going to write back and thank them for the opportunity. I'm going to tell them I'm deeply interested in the position, but I'm not able to start in December. I'll ask if they'd consider holding it for me, or if a similar position might be available in the spring or summer. And if they say no, Ron asked gently, then I'll know I made the right choice anyway, Hermione said, because the right opportunity won't force me to choose between the work and the life I'm building. It'll fit into both somehow. That evening, after Hermione had composed and sent her carefully worded response to the ministry, the family gathered in the sitting room. George had stayed for dinner, as he often did these days, and Ginny had stopped by after Quidditch practice, her hair still damp from the showers, her face glowing with the particular satisfaction that came from a practice well done. Molly was working on her knitting, a new project, this one looking like it might become a blanket for Thomas's bed. Arthur was reading the Evening Prophet, occasionally muttering about muggle-baiting articles. The children were playing a quiet game of gobstones in the corner, their laughter gentle and companionable. Ron stood and cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I have something to announce," he said, trying for casual, but unable to hide his nervous excitement. "George and I, well, we're making it official. I'm becoming a full partner in Weasley's Wizard Wheezes." The room erupted in congratulations. Molly actually cried, embracing both her sons at once. Arthur clapped Ron on the shoulder with fierce pride. Ginny whooped and demanded they name a product after her. Even the children applauded, caught up in the general joy. "And," Hermione added, standing beside Ron, "I've decided to stay at the Burrow for a while longer. I was offered a ministry position, but I'm not ready to leave yet. There's too much here that I still want to do." Molly's tears intensified, and she pulled Hermione into an embrace that smelled of lavender and home. "Oh, my dear girl, you're not leaving us yet. I'm so glad." Later, much later, when everyone had gone to bed and the house had settled into its nighttime creaking, Ron and Hermione stood at the window of their room, looking out at the frost-touched landscape silvered by moonlight. "We did it," Hermione said softly. "We figured it out." "We did," Ron agreed, his arm around her waist. "Turns out the answer wasn't choosing between things. It was choosing the timing, choosing what we need right now, and trusting that the rest will come when it's meant to." "The Burrow isn't a trap," Hermione mused, echoing the fears she'd voiced weeks ago. "It's a foundation, a place to build from, not a place to be stuck in." "Exactly," Ron said. "We're building something here. You with your projects and the kids, me with the shop and George. We're healing, we're growing, we're figuring out who we are outside of the war. And when we're ready, when it's time, we'll take the next steps. But for now, this is exactly where we're meant to be." Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and silent and steady. The Burrow stood solid beneath it, its crooked walls warm and bright with life, its magical foundations strong enough to weather any storm. And inside, two young people who had helped save the wizarding world were learning an even more difficult magic. The magic of building a life worth saving, of choosing their own paths, of supporting each other's dreams, even when those dreams led in different directions. The clock in the kitchen chimed midnight, its hands pointing to home for nearly everyone. And in their room under the eaves, Ron and Hermione held each other close, understanding finally that home wasn't a limitation, but a launching point. Not an end, but a beginning. Not a choice they had to make forever, but a choice they could make again and again in every season of their lives. December arrived at the Burrow dressed in white, transforming the familiar landscape into something from a fairy tale. Snow fell steadily through the first week of the month, blanketing the orchard and the garden, muffling the world in soft silence. The house glowed warm against the winter darkness, every window a beacon of golden light, smoke curling from the chimneys in lazy spirals that danced against the grey sky. Inside, the transformations of autumn had settled into permanence. The library had become the heart of the children's education, where Elspeth and Thomas spent hours reading and learning, their confidence growing daily. The insulation charms held strong against the winter cold, keeping every room comfortable without the constant drain of warming spells. The organizational systems Hermione had implemented had become second nature to everyone, though Molly still occasionally muttered about being able to find things too easily, robbing her of the adventure of the search. Ron's partnership with George had been formalized with proper legal documents and a small celebration at the shop in Diagon Alley. The mail-order business continued to flourish, expanding into international markets that George had never dreamed of reaching. Ron had discovered a talent, not just for organization, but for understanding what customers wanted before they knew themselves, for crafting marketing strategies that felt personal rather than commercial, for building relationships with suppliers and customers alike that transformed business transactions into genuine connections. And Hermione had received a response from the ministry, not a rejection, as she'd half feared, but a thoughtful letter from the minister herself. The position would be held open until June, giving Hermione time to finish what she'd started at the Burrow, to take her NUTs in the spring, to prepare herself properly for the work ahead. It was a grace period she hadn't expected, a gift that felt like the universe confirming she'd made the right choice. On a Saturday morning in mid-December, with snow falling softly outside and the smell of Molly's cinnamon rolls filling the house, the family gathered in the kitchen to begin preparing for Christmas. It had become a cherished tradition, this day of decoration and planning, of transforming the Burrow into a winter wonderland while reminiscing about Christmases past. But this year was different. This year, the shadow of loss hung over the preparations in a way it hadn't the year before, when everyone had been too numb with fresh grief to fully feel Fred's absence. This year, the healing had progressed enough that they could feel the missing piece more acutely, could notice the silence where his laughter should have been, could see the empty chair where he should have sat. George had been quiet all morning, his movements mechanical as he helped Arthur untangle the fairy lights that always seemed to knot themselves between one year and the next. Molly kept starting sentences and then trailing off, as if she'd been about to ask Fred something before remembering. Even Ginny, usually the most resilient of them all, had a fragile quality to her smile. It was Thomas who broke the careful tension, asking in his direct, innocent way, who was Fred? The question fell into silence. Everyone froze, unsure how to answer, what to say, whether speaking of him would hurt more than the silence. But then Hermione, surprising herself, began to speak. Fred was George's twin brother. He was one of the funniest, most creative, most alive people I've ever known. He and George ran the joke shop together. Everything you've seen Ron and George working on, Fred helped create. He died in the war, fighting to protect the school and everyone in it. Was he brave? Elspeth asked softly, her eyes wide. The bravest, Ron said, his voice thick. But he'd hate us saying that. He'd say he was just having a laugh, just doing what needed doing. That was Fred. He made even the serious things seem lighter somehow. And then, as if a dam had broken, the stories began to flow. George told about the time they'd tested Tun-Tung toffees on Dudley Dursley. Arthur recounted their early experiments with fireworks that had resulted in a 3-day ban from the garden. Ginny shared how Fred had helped her recover her confidence after her first year, making her laugh when she'd thought she'd never feel joy again. Molly, tears streaming down her face but smiling, described the elaborate April Fool's pranks they'd orchestrated throughout their childhood. Ron found himself talking about the war, about how Fred had stayed brave and funny even in the darkest moments, how he'd made terrible jokes during the Battle of Hogwarts, how his last words had been a laugh at Percy's sudden sense of humour. "He wouldn't want us to be sad at Christmas," George said finally, his voice rough but steady. "He'd want us to remember him by being the most ridiculous version of ourselves, by choosing joy even when it's hard, by living so fully that we're living for both of us." "Then that's what we'll do," Molly said firmly, wiping her eyes. "We'll make this the most joyful Christmas we can, for Fred, for all of us, for everyone who can't be here but who would want us to be happy." What followed was organized chaos of the best kind. They decorated the house from top to bottom, using every ornament and garland and magical decoration that generations of Weasleys had accumulated. Arthur enchanted the fairy lights to change colours based on the mood of whoever was nearest. Hermione taught the children how to make paper snowflakes, then showed them the charm to make the snowflakes dance through the air. Ron and George strung enchanted mistletoe that sang carols in slightly off-key harmony whenever anyone passed beneath it. Ginny transformed the sitting room into a winter forest, conjuring snow that fell but never accumulated, trees that glittered with frost that never melted. Molly baked enough food to feed an army, enlisting everyone's help. Even Arthur, who proved surprisingly competent at decorating gingerbread, though his figures all looked suspiciously like Muggle electronics. By evening, the Burrow had been transformed. Every surface gleamed, every corner twinkled with light, every room smelled of pine and cinnamon and magic. The Christmas tree that Arthur and Ron had cut from the orchard stood proud in the sitting room, decorated with ornaments that held memories. A tiny broomstick from Ron's first Quidditch match, a star that Ginny had made in primary school, a photo of the whole family from 5 Christmases ago, when everyone had still been alive and whole. They stood together looking at it. This imperfect, beautiful family in their imperfect, beautiful home, and Hermione felt something shift in her chest. This was what she'd been building toward all autumn. Not just organizational systems or household improvements, but this. A space where grief could coexist with joy, where loss could be honored without destroying the capacity for happiness, where a family could heal together while remembering what they'd lost. "It's perfect," Elspeth breathed, and Thomas nodded agreement, both children's faces glowing with wonder. "It really is," Hermione agreed softly, and meant it with her whole heart. That night, after the children had been put to bed and George had gone home and Ginny had flown back to her flat in London, Ron and Hermione walked out into the snowy garden. The storm had passed, leaving the world crystalline and still under a sky full of stars. Their footprints were the first to mark the fresh snow, and their breath formed clouds in the cold air. "Do you remember," Ron said quietly, "at the beginning of autumn, when we first came here, you were so worried about losing yourself, about becoming ordinary?" "I remember," Hermione said. "I was terrified." "Are you still?" Hermione considered the question, looking back at the Burrow with its glowing windows and smoking chimneys, thinking about the children inside who had found safety here, about Molly who had found help, about George who had found a reason to keep creating, about Ron who had found his own path. "No," she said finally, "I'm not. I think I understand now that I was asking the wrong question. It's not about whether I'm ordinary or extraordinary. It's about whether I'm living a life that matters, that helps people, that's true to who I am. And I am. We both are." Ron pulled her close, and they stood there in the snow, two people who had saved the wizarding world, learning that the harder magic was building a world worth saving in the first place. "I got my any-duty study schedule from Hogwarts," Hermione continued. "McGonagall's arranged for me to take the exams in the spring as an independent candidate, and I've been thinking about the ministry position. I'm going to take it when June comes. I'm ready for it now, or I will be." "I know," Ron said simply, "and I'll be here, at the shop, building things with George. We'll make it work." "We will," Hermione agreed. "Because the Burrow taught us that, didn't it? That home isn't about being in the same place all the time. It's about having a place to return to, a foundation to build from." Inside, through the kitchen window, they could see Molly moving about, putting away the last of the baking supplies, her movements slow and tired, but content. Arthur was visible in the sitting room, adding a last ornament to the tree. Somewhere above, the children were surely asleep in their beds, safe and warm, and beginning to believe in futures that held more than just loss. This was what they'd built over the autumn. Not just improvements to a house, but a true home. A place where broken things could be mended, where new beginnings could take root, where the past could be honoured without preventing the future. The Christmas weeks that followed were filled with a joy that felt earned rather than forced. Harry visited with a bottle of fire whiskey and stories of Auror training. Hagrid sent a tree that was slightly too large for the house, requiring creative shrinking charms. Hermione's parents sent a package of Muggle Christmas crackers that fascinated Arthur beyond all reason. On Christmas morning, they gathered around the tree in pyjamas and dressing gowns, passing gifts and drinking hot chocolate and enjoying the simple pleasure of being together. George laughed, really laughed, at one of Ron's terrible jokes. Elspeth received her first wand, a temporary one for practice until she was old enough for Hogwarts, and nearly cried with joy. Thomas got a book about famous auras that he immediately began reading, his face alight with dreams of his own future. Ron gave Hermione a journal, beautifully bound in leather, with her initials embossed on the cover. "For your thoughts," he said, "for planning your ministry reforms, or recording your days here, or whatever you want. But mainly, so you always have a place to put the things you're thinking, even when you can't say them out loud." Hermione gave Ron a set of enchanted ledgers for the shop, spelled to organize themselves and flag potential problems before they became crises. "Because you're brilliant at business," she said, "and these will help you be even more brilliant." They exchanged other gifts too, practical things and silly things and meaningful things. But those were the ones that mattered most, the ones that said, "I see who you really are, and I love that person." As January approached and the winter deepened, life at the Burrow settled into new rhythms. Hermione began her NUT studies in earnest, transforming her small study into a proper learning space. Ron and George continued expanding the shop, now planning to open a second location in Hogsmeade. The children prepared for the term at Hogwarts to resume, both of them now confident enough to look forward to it, rather than dread it. And through it all, the Burrow stood, solid. its crooked walls straightened by Hermione's charms, its warmth maintained by the insulation spells, its heart kept beating by the love of everyone within it. One evening in late January, as winter held the world in its grip and snow fell steadily outside, Hermione stood at the window of the library, looking out at the white landscape. Ron found her there, as he so often did, and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about autumn," Hermione said softly. "About how much has changed. About how I came here afraid of losing myself and instead found more of myself maybe, the parts I didn't know I wanted." "Like what?" "Like the part that finds joy in teaching children, the part that takes satisfaction in organizing spaces and making systems work, the part that can be content with small victories and quiet progress." She paused, then added, "The part that can build a home and still dream of changing the world." "You're going to do both," Ron said with absolute certainty. "You're going to go to the ministry in June, and you're going to reform wizarding law and make everything better. And then you're going to come home to the Burrow, to us, and tell us all about it, because that's who you are. Someone who can hold complexity, who doesn't have to choose just one thing." Hermione turned in his arms, looking up at him. This boy, this man, who had grown so much over their autumn together, who had found his own strength and purpose, who understood her better than she sometimes understood herself. "And you're going to build an empire of joy," she said. "You and George are going to make people laugh and create beautiful things and prove that choosing happiness is its own kind of rebellion against darkness. And I'm going to be so proud of you." They stood there as the snow fell and the fire crackled and the house breathed its gentle magic around them. Outside, the winter world was harsh and cold, but here, in this space they'd helped create, there was only warmth and understanding, and the quiet certainty of love. The Burrow had taught them what they needed to learn, that home was not a trap, but a foundation, that rest was not weakness, but necessary preparation, that choosing the timing of dreams was just as important as having dreams at all. They had learned to support each other's separate paths while building a shared life, to honor the past while building toward the future, to find joy in simple things while still reaching for extraordinary ones. As February arrived and the first hints of spring began to show in longer days and occasional thaws, Hermione began preparing for her NEWTs with characteristic intensity. Ron supported her by taking over more of the household tasks, by bringing her tea when she studied too late, by believing in her even when she doubted herself. And in quiet moments, when the studying was done and the work was finished, and the house settled into evening peace, they would find each other, in the library or the kitchen or their room under the eaves, and simply be together. No grand gestures, no dramatic declarations, just the steady, sustaining presence of two people who had chosen each other, and kept choosing each other every day in 1,000 small ways. The Burrow stood around them, this impossible house that had weathered war and loss and the passage of generations, its foundation stronger now for the work they'd done, its future secure in the hands of those who loved it. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked away the moments, its hands pointing to home for those who mattered. And in the library, in the kitchen, in every room and corner, the magic of family and love and carefully chosen lives hummed like a heartbeat. And when spring finally came, when Hermione took her NUTs and prepared to start at the ministry, when Ron and George opened their second shop location, they both knew they would carry the Burrow with them, not as a weight, but as a foundation, not as a limitation, but as a reminder of what they were building toward, not as an ending, but as a beginning that would sustain them through whatever came next. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our autumn journey at the Burrow, where two souls learned that the most powerful magic is the choice to build a life worth living, to support dreams while nurturing love, to find strength in foundations carefully laid. Let their peace be your peace now. Let the warmth of the Burrow enfold you as you drift toward sleep. Let the knowledge that home is always waiting, not to trap us, but to welcome us back, not to limit us, but to launch us forward, carry you gently into rest. Breathe deeply of the winter air, feel the warmth of love surrounding you, and know that you too can be many things, want many things, choose many things across the seasons of your life. There is no need to choose all or nothing. No need to be only one thing. No need to solve everything tonight. Rest now, dear listener. Rest in the peace of the Burrow, in the magic of autumn transformed to winter, in the promise that foundations built with love will hold through every storm. Sleep gently, sleep deeply, and dream of homes that welcome you back, of love that supports your becoming, of futures built on carefully chosen presents. Good night, dear listener. Good night.